I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the surrender and evacuation of Ukrainian soldiers in Mariupol's Azovstal steel plant, analyse the impact of the war on economies in the West, and hear from a Ukrainian MP heading to Brussels.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 17th of May, day 83. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls, and business reporter, Ben Gartside. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Yeah, hi David. Hi everybody. The big news overnight has been in Mariupol, the surrender of the remaining Ukrainian fighters there in the Azovstal steel plant. So we hear that after 82 days, 265 soldiers have surrendered. That includes 51 seriously wounded. They've been moved about 20 k's further east along the coast to Novorossovsk hospital. The remaining soldiers have been taken about 50 k's north into further into, or near Donetsk actually, into a town called Lonivka. Please apologise my pronunciation. So this is this brings to a close this chapter. Very interesting what it said about Ukrainian resistance and Russian efforts to take what, as we've said for a number of weeks actually, has had no military significance. It's been symbolic, and you'll remember that about, I think it was 3 weeks ago, Russia said that the battle for Mariupol was over, and then they continued fighting for the steel plant. So it showed just how symbolic it was to them at the time. It's going to be very interesting to see now how Russia play this, because if they do say, right, the battle for Mariupol is over, the public will be rightfully questioning, well, hang on, what happened a few weeks ago then? So it's almost in Russia's interest not to play it too strong a hand here. Interesting also from the Ukrainian point of view. I mean, it's amazing that they've lasted this long, but the conditions were horrendous. We can only imagine what they are like for the fighters and the civilians that are still there, still in the plant, and of course there's hundreds of thousands of civilians still in Mariupol city. But interesting the timing. So in the last few days, Ukraine has had a significant operational success in the north of the country, northeast around Kharkiv, pushing the Russian forces back as far as the border in some areas there. So this might have been a good time for Ukraine to try and negotiate about the soldiers left in the plant. They could say to Russia, okay, you can have your victory, you can take the whole of Mariupol, but you need to look after these people. Russia will know that any news that they might trumpet from the south could go some way to spiking the guns of the bad news that they've experienced in the north. So I'm just interested in the timing that just a couple of days after this big push around Kharkiv that this surrender finally happens. President Zelensky has said that the resistance there changed the course of the war. I think that's fair. We've discussed here before about how the last great effort those fighters were able to conduct was to soak up Russian forces, and at any one time we think Russia had up to 9 battalion tactical groups, each one being about 600 or 700 soldiers strong, committed to Mariupol. We think in the last couple of weeks that's gone down to 2. So freed up some fighting power, but of course they'll be exhausted. It'll take some time before those other battalion tactical groups are in any shape to go north and to assist in the fight in the Donbass. And just finally on this, so Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said that the fighters that have surrendered will be treated, quote, in accordance with international standards, unquote, he said. And he also said that President Putin had guaranteed this. Now, I wouldn't trust a Putin guarantee very far at all, but the fact that Dmitry Peskov says this, and there have been photos of the fighters coming out, I mean, it would be very difficult now for Russia to say that they had upheld international standards if those fighters that came out that have been seen to be in good order if they now are at all mistreated. The fact that they've been held in separatist held areas, so they're not in Russia, they've not gone to a third country. There is talk of doing a prisoner transfer for Russian prisoners of war. A bit of pushback in the Russian Duma, the state parliament, about that, but that's entirely possible. But it is notable, I think, that the wounded and the other fighters have gone to separatist held areas in the Donbass rather than Russia proper. Whether this was brokered between Ukraine and Russia or with the help of the UN or the International Committee of the Red Cross, we don't know. But it is a significant event in the course of this war, and what happens next, how Russia plays it, and what happens to those fighters, and of course, let's never forget the civilians involved as well, will also speak volumes about where we are in this war. I'll pause there.
So a victory, but a Pyrrhic victory for the Russian forces. Dom, how do you think this changes the strategic situation in the south of Ukraine if Mariupol has finally fallen?
Well, I don't think it changes it massively. So from the Russian side, they basically controlled that part of the Sea of Azov, which is the small portion of the northeast part of the Black Sea. The port facilities have been badly degraded, so it's going to be some time before they're able to use them, and quite what utility they would get out of them is questionable anyway. So not a massive strategic victory for Russia, bar being able to say, bar being able to colour a bit more red in on the map, but they've already priced that in. Like I say, a few weeks ago they had declared victory in Mariupol. So what they're going to do now to squeeze another victory out of this, we're not sure. On the Ukrainian side, again, it's a loss of fighters and civilians, and many people, both civilians and soldiers, would have died in recent weeks because they've been trapped in there with no access to decent living conditions, food, water, sanitation, medical care. So there'll be a lot of people who are not alive today that might have been had this surrender happen earlier. However, in the grand strategic view of it, this has been an amazing success for Ukraine, and they will hold it as such. I mean, this resistance, it speaks volumes about the Ukrainian character. This will go alongside the Moskva, off you go, go sink yourself. Comment of earlier in the war. So these events will have significant impact for Ukrainian society. It is not a massive tactical loss in as much as it won't really affect the passage of the war in that geographic area. So, I don't want to put it down as blandly as who's the winner, who's the loser here. But I think Ukraine have already taken more from this resistance and will continue to do so long after Russia gain any geographic advantage or try and spin it at home as the victory we told you about 3 weeks ago. Well, actually, it's really finally happened. So, I think Ukraine probably have the symbolic victory more than Russia.
Just a couple more quick ones for you, Dom, I think, before we bring Ben in. There was lots of explosions last night in Lviv. And also an interesting thing I thought this morning that the Telegraph has picked up, how a Russian state TV commentator has admitted on TV that Russia is isolated and Ukraine's military is formidable. Both interesting stories. Would you like to just take us through both of them?
Yeah, so on the former, the ability of Russia to fire munitions across the whole of Ukraine has not diminished. The ability to fire precision munitions has massively diminished, which is not necessarily a good thing. It's good that they don't have any of the stocks left of these things, but actually they're then left with unguided munitions, either artillery or air-launched missiles, and their air force is rarely venturing much out of the Donbass. It's rarely venturing forward of its own troops for fear of Ukrainian air defence systems. We think a lot of these explosions in Lviv came from the Black Sea, possibly submarine launched cruise missiles from the Black Sea. But what this shows is, I mean, these are punitive strikes. I mean, they're not knitted together with any great sort of operational impetus. They are there. I suppose Russia would say they're attempting to destroy the flow of Western arms into Ukraine. But I mean, that, as we've discussed before, you need a lot more than just a munition to do that. You've got to have effective targeting, real-time targeting, or as near real-time as you can get if this stuff's being moved by rail or road. I think Ukraine have learnt not to store these things all in one place. They're being dispersed and pushed forward to troops very quickly after coming into the country. So Russia's not achieving a huge amount by this type of activity. However, we've seen that they don't really care about the indiscriminate use of aerial bombardment. Today's Defence Intelligence assessment from MOD said that as more is discovered from the north of the country, around the area of Chernihiv, they say that there's about 3,500 homes that have been destroyed in the area, and it just speaks to this indiscriminate use of artillery. They really don't care if it's either a civilian target or possibly a military target that might be near civilian targets, or that's unlikely. So yeah, it speaks to this indiscriminate use of air or air delivered munitions, because they can't achieve much on the ground. They're still stalled in the Donbass. As for the comments from Moscow, we've seen a couple of this talk show that's usually good fire-breathing stuff, all fairly easily ignored, but they do occasionally have a sort of wake-up call and talk about reality. And it has been assessed in the past that this is the Kremlin's way of just floating an idea out to see how it's received by the public. So let's say the Kremlin wants to try and work out how it can prepare Russian society for the news that Kharkiv, the front in Kharkiv, has been pushed right back. And in fact, there's unconfirmed reports this morning that Ukrainians up in the northeast of Kharkiv have crossed the Seversky Donets River, and that would be hugely significant. If they're across that river, then they can really start getting stuck into those supply lines coming down from Belgorod in Russia. So if this is some experiment to see what the appetite is for a more sensible discussion in Russian society, that might be one explanation for it. There might also be, again, there's been an assessment that perhaps after failing to take the entire country and failing in this lightning strike to take Kyiv in the opening hours of the war, assessed to be the first 72 hours was the objective, to take Kyiv and to win the war, that Putin's downgraded his objectives to the Donbass and holding that land corridor through to Crimea. I mean, this might be a way of testing the water with Russian society to see what the appetite is for keeping going, or maybe entering negotiations here. It's almost impossible to tell with Russian state media. However, they don't say anything that's not Kremlin approved. So I'd be very surprised if this had just slipped out by accident and there wasn't some wider scheme at play. And if so, my assessment would be that this is the Kremlin just testing the water to see where to take the temperature of the public after quite a few setbacks in the recent weeks.
Thanks, Dom. Ben Gartside, thank you very much for joining us again. Can we talk about some of the economic issues and news that's emerged in the last few days? We saw, I think it's helpful now to zoom out of Ukraine a little bit and just talk about how the war's impacting other societies. Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, he warned yesterday of apocalyptic, that's a quote marks, apocalyptic global food price rises, and said that he is helpless in the face of surging inflation as the economy is battered by the war in Ukraine. Can you talk us through his remarks and just and tell us why is he saying what he's saying, and actually what can central banks do to mitigate the effects of the war?
Sure. So Andrew Bailey's comments yesterday come as kind of part of a wider, apart from him on the war and inflation. There is obviously a huge amount of inflationary pressure causing a cost of living crisis across the UK, but also globally. And Andrew Bailey's comments come as part of kind of a warning to people about where this is going to go. I think with the energy bill cap rises that happened in the past couple of months, people have thought that perhaps we're getting to the end of this inflationary pressure as opposed to the start, when sadly this is kind of the beginning as opposed to the end, with further energy price rises expected later this year. So Bailey kind of said in these comments that he warned about global food price rises, as you said, and he's played down the role that the Bank of England can have in stopping this, and played up the role that, for example, the war in Ukraine has had on these price rises. And it's worth saying that this is during a position where the Bank of England's independence is seemingly at play again. It was famously made independent by New Labour in the beginning of the 2000s and has benefited from that in recent years. However, there's been a lot more critique of Andrew Bailey with cabinet ministers and kind of government sources increasingly becoming critical of his role. So kind of back to the question in terms of what happens next and kind of what's happening here. It looks like we're going to hit around 10% cost price inflation later this year, which is very, very high. And while this is high, the Bank of England has known that it would be high for some time, and this predates the war in Ukraine. In early February, again pre-war, it was anticipated that inflation would hit around 7% in the second quarter of the year, which is far above the 2% target which the government gives the Bank of England. It doesn't want inflation to be any higher than 2%. So it's been known that this is kind of going to have an impacting effect. The Bank of England has a number of things it can do. Chiefly, it's in charge of interest rates, and we've seen interest rate rises in recent months. Bailey's again going to come under pressure to rise interest rates further. However, this is not something that comes without cost. The British public utilises loans and needs low interest rates in many regards, whether that's in our housing stock. Many people have got mortgages that are contingent on low interest rates for them to be able to make payments. Some people have buy now, pay later loans or kind of sofas, whatever, on finance. And people with those type of deals are going to see increasing pressure on their finances by not only interest rates, but kind of high cost through cost price inflation.
Thanks, Ben. There was also some interesting news. McDonald's is pulling out of Russia after more than 30 years of selling their goods there. They're taking a $1.4 billion hit from the decision. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about this because it has knock-on effects, and it's a useful case study in a sense of how businesses are dealing with the war.
Yeah, the McDonald's case is fascinating because I think while to you and me it's kind of the home of very cheap fast food, it's much more of a cultural item within Russia. I mean, this morning, upon the kind of exit of the company, the chief executive, Chris Kempczynski, described the company as embodying the notion of glasnost, the kind of post-Soviet liberalizations. It was a very iconic moment when citizens of the former Soviet Union were able to buy Big Macs and able to buy these things that were previously held up as kind of the embodiment of US society and free markets and capitalism. So the decision to pull out is very notable. The fast food giant has around 850 restaurants in the country and 62,000 employees. So this isn't like with some companies where they've got a very, very small footprint in Russia. McDonald's has a very sizable presence. And the company intends to, quote, de-arch outlets, so that's removing the McDonald's name, logo, branding and menu, while they are sold to a local buyer. However, it will retain the trademark in Russia. And McDonald's say that it's no longer tenable or consistent with McDonald's values to stay in the country. This is quite a significant hit on McDonald's balance sheet. This will cost them, Russia and Ukraine kind of contribute. Both Ukraine stores are still closed for obvious reasons. It contributes around 10% of their annual revenue, which is around £1.6 billion. And the company expects to kind of incur costs of around $1.4 billion from closing. And it comes to a point regarding how Western companies are leaving Russia if they are doing so. You've got some like McDonald's and kind of the oil companies is another example who, while it took a bit of pressure for them to get to that point, they've very fundamentally left the country or kind of fundamentally trying to decouple from Russia. You have other companies, including Burger King and Marks and Spencer, who say they're unable to close stores because of a franchise deal where basically they've sold the rights to the name and the branding to a Russian operator, and they receive money from this Russian operator, but they are not involved in the day-to-day business in the same way McDonalds or kind of Netflix or other companies are. And it fundamentally comes down to kind of the nuances within corporate structure and also the willingness of businesses to be able to kind of extricate themselves from the Russian economy. It's quite a big statement that McDonald's has, given kind of how iconic the brand is in Russia and has become, and how symbolic it's become too. So it's kind of quite interesting and will heap more pressure onto those companies that perhaps haven't pulled out or have promised to pull out but haven't actually got around to doing so yet, to actually kind of really energise their work here, because McDonald's pulling out is really, really quite symbolic.
Thanks, Ben. I know, Dom, you had a question.
Yeah, please, Ben. I'm interested in this idea about the sort of corporate social responsibility and the values argument for pulling out. And I just wondered if you had a view on whether or not the companies that would take this financial hit will in any way get financial assistance from their governments, because it's clearly in line with government strategy, or if they're doing it because they think it will affect them simply from the values argument. And I'm thinking that in recent years we've seen this push for buyers to be more to sort of own their purchases more, and for companies to reflect that in their ethical choices and sourcing and supply chains and so on and so forth. But it hasn't ever really broken through to the extent that this has. And I wonder if will the Green lobby, for example, be looking on almost with envy that it takes a massive war to make some of these companies sit up and start making choices in line with values, or is this just too big and they had to do it?
It's quite an interesting question, and it's a good one, because I think that very, very. It's what we're seeing is that governments, rather than kind of offering financial assistance for people to pull out, it's been much more of a stick approach than a carrot, to kind of use a tortured metaphor. We've seen Shell and BP got called in by Kwasi Kwarteng and read the Riot Act regarding their kind of continued existence in Russia. And there is therefore a significant pressure on companies. It's also worth saying, from a much more cynical point of view, at the moment, that while the Russian economy has been impacted by sanctions, if they continue, it will be much more significantly impacted, especially if the ruble devalues further. In many cases, this is the best opportunity businesses are going to have to sell these Russian subsidiaries, companies, joint ventures, because if they wait a year, then who knows what the state of the Russian economy is going to be if the war continues and perseveres. So there is kind of a dual role in kind of why these companies are pulling out. In terms of kind of the Green lobby and other areas, I think it is kind of quite a strong example of what concerted, continued pressure can achieve with the Green lobby and kind of with environmental campaigners. If they look at kind of use of fossil fuels or stuff like that, there is many ways that corporations can kind of guise their emissions or their roles in these projects, or kind of offset them via the purchasing of carbon credits or kind of other mitigants to kind of downplay the impact that their investments are having. With kind of the conflict in Russia, it's very, very black and white. You either have a Russian operation or you don't, and you are in control of it or it's franchised. So it's left a lot of room that kind of CEOs, companies are unable to hide behind, and a lot of governments have been very, very blunt, especially kind of Zelensky being very eager to call out companies who are still working with Russia. There is nowhere to hide, and they kind of know it's a race. Either they're going to do it first and they can get a round of applause, or it's going to come with egg on their face following kind of sustained pressure from either their own national governments, whether it be Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, Kwasi Kwarteng, or kind of even more painfully, kind of the government of Ukraine. So I think that's really kind of exercised a lot of corporations.
Thanks, Ben. That was absolutely fascinating. Do you have anything else you think our listeners should know? Or shall I swing back to Dom?
I think just quickly, in terms of the discussion we were having with Andrew Bailey, I think kind of what's interesting is, while Ukraine has been blamed and kind of it has had an impact on inflation, there's been a notion that it's been the bulk of the impact. And I think it's worth pointing to a number of other impacts that the war has had, and kind of and things that aren't the war has had on cost price inflation, because we've the world has reopened following a pandemic. There is suddenly demand is much higher for fuels, which has pushed them up. China is still in a lockdown situation, which means that cheaper goods that people would usually use have been less easy to get hold of, and supply chains have been disrupted. So when kind of Andrew Bailey and others point to Ukraine solely as the impact, there is a question there, and kind of it should be taken with a pinch of salt. It's definitely had an inflationary impact, but I think there's been an attempt to carry goodwill for the inflationary environment by pointing to the Ukraine war and the impacts that will have, when that isn't the total impact. There's very clearly been a policy failure in kind of numerous governments in curbing inflation. And while it is a global issue, kind of it's worth bearing that in mind when you see future coverage.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. That was hugely in-depth, I think just what we needed. To move slightly away from economics, Dom Nicholls, there's a fascinating article in today's Telegraph, or it's certainly online, about how there's some suggestion that Vladimir Putin is taking personal control over Russian units in the battle in Donbass. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so thanks. Fascinating article, Ben. Note, fascinating article. Anyway, so this came out of an event yesterday. I was in Parliament yesterday for a speech by Admiral Tony Radican, the Chief of the Defence Staff, and so he was speaking. He says that he was saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is part of a much larger struggle, and he was saying that we very often get wrapped up in Western sort of dialogue with defence and security boffins about the rules-based international order. And he said, but actually, you don't really know when these things are challenged until it's right in front of your face. And he says the fighting in Ukraine is really going to show whether these rules matter or not. And he was saying that the amazing resistance by Ukraine shows that they are on the front line of the defence of values, as he sees it. He went further. He said that Ukraine's survival is guaranteed. I thought that was quite an interesting comment from CDS. But it was a very, very bullish response, saying that in no way suggesting that British support for Ukraine will lessen. And he was very clear. He said that the Prime Minister had given him very clear direction, saying Putin must fail. So it was an interesting talk from CDS. At that event, I was speaking to a military source, and the military source said that Putin and General Gerasimov, the head of Russia's armed forces, have both been seen to be meddling, basically, in the Russian tactical operations. I mean, they shouldn't be there at all, but he was saying they were meddling down at a level you would expect a colonel or brigadier to be operating. So if we think about colonel, brigadier, colonel in the Russian army, probably in charge of a battalion tactical group, about 700 people, a brigadier in charge of a brigade of maybe 3 or 4 battalion tactical groups, so let's say a couple of thousand, 2,500. I mean, these are really tactical groupings. And for the head of the armed forces, for Gerasimov to be involving himself to that degree is just extraordinary. We wrote a couple of weeks ago when there was the visit, when Gerasimov went into Ukraine, we thought he was there just to sort of do a bit of shouting and arm waving. But if he was actually there to direct military action, I mean, it's just staggering. Even more so when you take that to the next level up, to Putin. Because what should happen, ideally, at this level, so Putin, the politician, the leader, should be looking up and out. They should be in no way, not in no way interested in the military action, but their job is to keep society on board, keep any international alliance together and strong, and to seek more friends. I mean, he does need new friends. So the politician should be looking up and out. Fairly similar for Gerasimov, the head of the military should also be looking up. His job should be to get the resources from the politicians for what the military needs, and then he should shape the military accordingly to whatever the assessed threats are. Of course, needs to look down, ideally, and to instill a culture of values and discipline and all the other things that we take for granted over here and are seemingly lacking in this Russian army. But yeah, Gerasimov mainly should be looking up, because of course underneath him, after the chaotic first few weeks of the war, when the army seemed to be having 3 different wars, one in the north, one in the east, one in the south. Then the Air Force was laid over the top of that and just seemed to be going around doing its own thing. The Navy in the Black Sea were wobbling around, threatening an amphibious landing and lobbing missiles in. So there were about 5 different wars going on. So Dvornikov was then put in charge of the overall theatre of Ukraine to pull all these pieces together, to coordinate action, to bring the land, air and sea together with cyber effects and information and all the rest of it, to run the campaign. And then, of course, underneath General Dvornikov as the theatre commander, you'd have various other generals, either sort of major general or lieutenant general, in charge of combined arms armies. And only below that would you then have brigadiers in charge of a pretty small chunk of real estate, depending where it is. But I would imagine in the Donbass, a brigade has probably got a front of about 5 to 10 Ks, maybe 15 Ks, depending on the ground. Within that brigade, you've then got the battalion tactical groups commanded by a colonel, and they'd be given very, very stiff boundaries. That they can't just roam wherever they like, because they'll be trampling all over their colleagues to left and right. So a battalion tactical group would have a fixed objective in front of them, very clear boundaries to left and right, and off they go. So if that is the level to which Putin and Gerasimov are said to be meddling, it is extraordinary. I mean, you need to be some kind of savant to run a country and run a military campaign at that level at the same time, and Putin has shown that he's not that kind of person. And what it also shows is this complete lack of trust that runs through the whole system. It is very difficult to adopt the doctrine that we have in the West of mission command, which is you tell the people beneath you what you want them to achieve, you give them a fixed amount of resources, fixed time, constraints, and then just let them get on with it. Let them use their initiative. They're the people on the ground. They're the people sniffing the cordite. They can see the problem set in front of them. They know what the reality is of their equipment state, the morale, and all the rest of it. They can see what the problem is and how best to solve it. So you need to trust them to get on with it. It takes a huge amount of courage to do that. More so today, when with digital technology, it is possible to know the location of every single soldier, every single vehicle. And the temptation is for senior commanders to lean in and get this information and say, oh no, go north a bit or go left a bit, or we should do that, or move your artillery over here. It takes great trust in the chain of command to resist that temptation and just to let your subordinate commanders get on with it. And in my former life, when I used to dress as a tree, I had briefly as a boss General Mark Carleton-Smith, who's the current head of the army, Sir Mark Carleton-Smith. And he had this expression. He used to say that it was up to commanders to delegate until it hurts and then delegate some more. I mean, that was his philosophy. Just really push that decision-making down. Give them the resources, give them the constraints, but push that decision-making down. Because otherwise, you're stymieing initiative. You're not allowing people to take advantage as it presents itself on the battlefield. You're not allowing them to push on from one objective to another if the ground and the situation allows it. And it just slows everything down. If all the decisions have to go back up to the top of the tree for a yes, no, and then come back down, it just absolutely slows the whole thing down. And we've seen that in the Russian advance. And it all comes down to trust. You've got to trust the people above and below and to the left and right. And if that's not there, then that will play out in all sorts of areas. And I think what we've seen from the Russian forces over the last few months of this war is these little sort of hernias of mistrust and lack of leadership, and where culture has just gone badly wrong. Some of the discipline breaches, the impact in the north around Bucha, these atrocities that we're seeing. I mean, this is not, as I said at the time, this is, most armies, most of the time, do not act like that. The vast majority of armies, the vast majority of the time, do not act like that. This is not normal. And it all comes down to a culture of the military, and that to a very great degree comes down to the trust that is held by one soldier to another, up and down, left and right. And if these reports are correct from the military source, very, very senior military source, that Putin and Gerasimov are fiddling around at sort of battalion tactical group / brigade level, then it speaks of a complete lack of trust running through the entire system and just a rotten culture.
Thanks, Dom. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about your career dressing up as a tree. But before that, just very quickly, for those of us who are not military minded, can we just be clear? So the implication is they're interfering on a level where it might be saying things like, you guys over here, go shell that building, or move into that wood, or hide behind this, like that kind of level of control freakery.
Well, the military source wouldn't give any examples of actions that we have seen and we can point to that would possibly you'd be able to reverse engineer that and work out what the source is or what the technical means are that allow them to know that level of decision making. But as I say, a battalion tactical group and even a brigade would have such a narrow frontage in the fighting in the Donbass. These are tiny pieces of real estate, such that if that's the level, it's not quite down to destroy that building, go to the right of that village. But not much more than that, to be perfectly honest. And if they're fiddling like that, it just speaks. I mean, if they've got the attention to detail such that they can do that all over the place, then good luck to them. But they clearly haven't, because they've made a mess of it in many other areas. I mean, in the British Army, we used to call this thing the long-handled screwdriver. It was as if the boss up the top had this massive long screwdriver, and he was reaching in and tinkering around with the engine from afar. And it was so annoying because they haven't got the most up-to-date information. They don't know the problem set. They don't know the pressures you're under, and they don't trust you. If you say I can do that, but I can't do that, they don't trust you. They say, well, I don't care. I want you to do it anyway. It just goes against all sensible application of military force. If that is what's been happening, it's not surprising that this assault has stumbled and stuttered to a halt in the Donbass.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Dom, sorry. Ben, I know you had a question, and after that, if there are no more updates, let's move to our final thoughts, please.
Great, thank you, David. And that's kind of really interesting, Dom. Just in terms of kind of the history of this, from a basic perspective, I've not got that much kind of knowledge of kind of military or kind of tactics around this. Is this kind of precedented at all? Is there any examples of where kind of generals or kind of even leaders, as in like Putin, have had that much kind of day-to-day involvement or kind of tinkering and kind of backseat driving, if you will, of a war? Is that kind of precedented, and how did that go for those armies? Does this kind of suggest that the house of cards may fall very quickly, or is it kind of hard to say what the kind of impact on kind of a much more kind of macro long-term scale of the war will be from this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. I mean, it is always hard to say. Predicting war is a mug's game. The enemy gets a vote, as they say, so you can never say with any great certainty. But Hitler was famous for this in the Second World War. He used to love playing fantasy fleets, and towards the end of the war, when literally the formations simply were not there, they were still on paper, and he was trying to move things around that just did not exist. He would really micromanage, and obviously that didn't end well. I mean, it comes down to the best people making the best decisions, or being in the position to make the best decisions they can. And generally, politicians are not great at playing at the military, and vice versa. Plenty of examples of that around the world. And very senior military leaders are so far away from, as I say, that the realities of the ground, that they are, in some respects, they think they've got more information because they can physically see with satellites or friendly force trackers. If you've got the digital technology will allow you to see. It's possible to see where every soldier and every vehicle is, and they think they know the most, but they don't have that. I'd say the whiff of cordite in the nostrils. They don't know what's going on, and it generally doesn't end well if they try to do that. Now, having said that, there does come a time when you just need to get on and do it. Quite frankly, in the military, I remember a senior officer once saying to me when I'd come up with yet another brilliant idea, he said, "Dom, we're here to uphold democracy, not practice it." And there is an element of that. There's sometimes when you've just got to say, we're doing this, we're going forward. I mean, if you look at the last few months of the Second World War, certainly from the British perspective, Montgomery he was replacing very senior commanders on a very regular basis because you've got to push through that, as it was a meat grinder towards the end of the Second World War. You've got to get it done. You've got to get the task done. So there is a time and a place for telling and saying get on with it. But most of the time, there's not room for that. Most of the time, you should say, "This is what I want you to achieve. I don't really care how you go about it. Here's the resources to do it." So I'm not suggesting there's never a time for senior officers to say just JFDI, just flipping do it, or equivalent. But most of the time, it doesn't work like that. And most of the time, if the situation is not absolutely appropriate for a JFDI approach, then it's going to end badly.
Well, thank you, Dom, and thank you, Ben, for your contributions there. I think we've come to the end of our time here. What are your thoughts for the week, for the rest of the week ahead? Can we sum up?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I'm going to be the crack record. I've been saying northeast, southwest for some time now. So keep your eyes on the southwest, Snake Island, the island in the northwest of the Black Sea that has to be held by it confers great military advantage to whoever holds it. Russia probably can't do an amphibious assault in the Odessa region without holding it because of the air defence and the anti-ship capabilities that could be based there. And equally, Ukraine have to hold it for those reasons. Northeast, around Kharkiv, I've been saying keep an eye on whether or not that push can go any further. If these reports are confirmed that they've crossed the river, the Seversky Donets River, and they will then be able to bite into those supply lines coming south. So I'm quite surprised. I ask you to take these reports with extreme caution until we can confirm them, because I would have thought they'd be very, very tired after the fighting up there. I'm surprised that they had gone for this. But I mean, if they have, this is just as a slight segue, sorry I'm rambling a little bit, but this is what I mean about mission command. So if the forces up in that region saw the opportunity in front of them, saw the ground in front of them was suddenly vacated by the Russian forces, then the local commanders might have said, right, let's keep going, let's keep pushing, let's move east, let's get across the river, let's hold the bridgehead, rather than if their mission had just been push the Russians back to the border and make sure their artillery is out of range of Kharkiv. Instead of just stopping at that point, if the opportunity presents itself and you think it's a sensible military risk to take, then push on, go and do it to a logical bound, a logical sort of place, geographic place and in time, when you can stop. So a long way of saying keep an eye on the northeast and the southwest.
Thanks, Dom. Ben Gartside, would you like the final words?
Sure. So I think just from a business and economics perspective, kind of what's worth looking at is kind of the knock-ons from both of the points we've discussed today. So in terms of kind of McDonald's exit from Russia, does this put kind of businesses who are still there or still have an extensive footprint in Russia under further pressure? Because as with the fuel companies, when one goes, the rest of them follow pretty quickly. So will we see kind of more pressure on those who still have a footprint or have pledged to kind of pause businesses as opposed to completely pull out? Is there now going to be kind of a continued force from Zelensky, from politicians kind of in the home nations of the countries these companies are based in, to actually say, you know what, pause isn't enough, we need to kind of eject completely and get you out of there, because there's no moral reason to still be kind of operating. And then just on inflation, I think this is going to be the biggest story kind of the next calendar year. But in terms of where does the pushback come to Andrew Bailey? We've seen the TUC criticise his comments on kind of don't ask for a pay rise this year, while earning 575 grand yearly, as Governor Bailey does, or from the right wing perspective of kind of criticising his lack of ability to control inflation and keep interest rates low, and kind of potentially did we do too much quantitative easing in the pandemic, which is now coming back to bite us, and kind of the impact of the Ukraine war of that. How do our finances look? What is the British public's toleration for kind of continued economic hardship, which, as is being described by Andrew Bailey, is because of the war, when kind of, as we've already mentioned today, that's one factor of many. So I think having a look at kind of what is the pushback on countries still operating within Russia, or have paused their operations but still have kind of companies within Russia, and what is kind of the political reaction to Andrew Bailey in his latest comments today.
Yesterday, I spoke to Mariia Ionova. Mariia is a People's Deputy of Ukraine, sitting in the opposition European Solidarity Party. We actually spoke to her before, on the 11th of March, very early on in the conflict, so I wanted to call her again to catch up to see how the war had changed, and to ask what she's up to now. Mariia was elected in 2012 and sits on the Committee of Foreign Affairs. I called her at the airport as she was on her way to Brussels. She spoke about her contact with the soldiers in the Azovstal steel plant and shared some details on her negotiations with European neighbours.
So today is 82 days of invasion of Russia Federation. Atrocities, war crimes, and acts of genocide against Ukrainian nation. And the main issue, of course, that Putin, he has gone complete crazy. Of course, he still doesn't understand that there is no victory he could sell to the world. But our bleeding wound, if I can name like this, it's of course Mariupol. Because Mariupol, first of all, became the symbol of the Ukrainian courage and dedication, and of course strength and resilience. And also we have spoken with you that Mariupol, that what Putin would like to do with the whole Ukraine. Of course, we really rely also on leaders and international organizations that they're doing more than even they could to save our soldiers and civilian people who are still in Azovstal. Because many friends and believe me, I know I visited Mariupol, started from 2014, July. And that is why, of course, there are guys whom I personally know from Sea Guards, from Marines and others. I mean, it's for each Ukrainian, it's very personal.
So are you still in contact with them? And if you are, what do they tell you?
They are absolutely not blaming. They understand that they will fight till the end. But of course, they still hope that international society, international leadership, they can find the way how to save them. And they have already announced this. Because can you imagine that there are like hundreds of our guys there, and they are fighting with the 20,000 Russian forces. So their heroism, their actions, they are already in the history. But of course, we really would like them to save, and because while Mariupol is still fighting our guys, then of course Putin is not able, to remove his forces to other direction, to increase his Russian forces in Kharkov or in Donbass.
And when you speak to your friends in Mariupol, do they still have hope that they might survive, or do they think this might be it, and that, as you said, they're prepared to die?
I also talked to the wives of that military guys who are already prisoners of Russian guys, and all I know that they're fighting. And all they're addressing is they will fight till the end. They will never give up, because that there were some hybrid messages that our military guys with the white flag went out. No, I mean, nobody could believe it, because we know that they will fight till the end. But of course, we still hope. We are optimists, and we stay optimist not only that Ukraine will withstand and Putin will fail, but we're absolutely sure that Ukraine rebuilt into a country of our dreams, because I visited also very small villages around in Kyiv Oblast, like started from Matyzhin to Borodyanka, and we spoke with the people, and they are already working. Their houses are bombed, and they're cleaning the stones and trying to build their houses again. So, and they have this wishes and desires that all these Russian criminals has to be punished in international tribunal.
You are currently on the way to Brussels. Why are you going there? What are you going to do? What are you going to tell the Europeans?
First of all, this is our parliamentary association committee. That's like separate small institution between the Parliament of Ukraine and European Parliament. Of course, we will advocate and promote that our country deserves to get candidacy status for our country. The pollings are saying that 92% of Ukrainian people would like to be part of European Union. And I'm sure that Ukrainian nation deserves to be, because we are fighting now for real democratic and European principles and values. Also, we will open an exhibition about the war in Ukraine and many photos from, different towns of Ukraine, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Kiev, Kherson, other, Mariupol, of course, that the reality is different. But also, we also wanted to speak with the representatives of that countries who are still, doubts on energy, gas and oil embargo, because it's time, to get out from comfort zone and probably, yes, to buy these energy resources on expensive, on higher price, but not to betray, democratic principles, because we have to show that dictators could be defeated, and that democracy is a strong model of the managing countries. So we also have to show altogether that EU countries are able not only to defend democracy, but also to fight for this in different ways. And that is why I think that will be our messages also, that this is a geopolitical now fight, really, that Putin has to understand that there are no ways that all the world will defend democratic principles and values. Of course, Ukrainians now are on the battlefield, but EU leaders, EU countries can do it by other actions.
So that's your message to parliamentarians from places like Hungary, that
Yes,
higher prices for gas and oil are worth it because of how important democracy is.
Yes. For example, I visited some Baltic countries, and of course Lithuania and Estonia, and of course it was more on advocating, because they're advocating us also in connection with USA and all other countries of EU, because they were with Ukraine and they were telling who is Putin, started from 2014, that the strategy of dialogue and appeasement of Russia is failed. But now they have, more capacity and more rights to speak more loud about this. And also in USA and Canada, and of course Great Britain, I didn't visit, but we are in contact and we see all your great support, and not only solidarity in words, but also by actions, because for us the main issue is actions, and we see these actions, and that is why we really appreciate such actions. But again, what I would like to say, I didn't change my mind. It's not yet enough, especially on the weapon, and that is why, of course, we continue to ask more offensive and defensive weapon to our Ukrainian armed forces. We have liberated regions, and we have still towns under occupation, and that is why we need to liberate them also. But for that, we need offensive weapon, very serious. Putin will fail again, but again, the main guarantee for us, not only EU candidacy, but I think that the main security guarantee is NATO membership. And we hope that we will fulfill our criteria, and also NATO will not, afraid of any messages and blackmailing. Putin blackmails, and all the countries will accept our country as a member of NATO.
You mentioned just then the United Kingdom's contribution. How did Boris Johnson's speech go down with you and your colleagues in the Verkhovna Rada when he made it the other week?
Yeah, I just wanted also to say a few words about this because it was very inspiring, it was very strong, and we really need such support of Sahara-American leaders. But of course, for my colleagues, for our faction, and I'm sure for the majority of the Parliament of Ukraine, the words that we have to save also democratic principles inside our country is very important, because we are fighting not to be Russia. And that is why we have, to continue to save this freedom of speech, rule of law, human rights, people's lives, and all other principles which we are fighting for. That is why it is so important to remember this unity has to be in actions and not only, in the speeches. And that is why that it was so important when Boris Johnson reminded us what democracy is and not to lose what we have. And sorry, I have to go because we are boarding.
Not at all. Have a very good journey. Thank you so much for talking to us, Mariia.
Thank you so much.
Have a good journey.
Happy to hear you. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.